Hi, I'm Tim from Atlassian, and today I'm going to show you how to build a super quick add-on for Bitbucket using the new Atlassian Connect framework. Now this add-on is going to add a new little menu item to the left-hand side of the Bitbucket UI. You'll see that text there, file types, and when you click on that, it's going to show you a word cloud of the different types of files in your repository. And the font size of each file type is going to be relative to the number of times that particular file type occurs. So the intent of this add-on is that you can see at a glance the different types of files there are in a particular repo. So you can see this particular repo is pretty heavy on JavaScript, HTML, less, soy, and PNG graphics, for example. All right, so a Bitbucket add-on is basically a standalone web service that is registered with Bitbucket. So we're going to have to actually create a new application. So we're going to create a new directory here, call it the Bitbucket type cloud. And just like any software project, let's create a new Git repository to track the changes that we're making, just in case I screw something up. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a thing called a descriptor, which is basically a blob of JSON that describes our web service in such a way that Bitbucket knows how to render it in the Bitbucket UI. So this is just a simple JSON file with, first of all, some metadata that describes it. So let's call it the Bitbucket type cloud. That key has to be unique across all of Bitbucket because we use that to track when your add-on is upgraded, for example. Then it needs a name, which is just a human readable name for our add-on, and that's what's going to be displayed inside the Bitbucket UI when users install and uninstall your add-on. And then we'll just have a little description, which describes very briefly what our add-on is doing. So let's say it shows a word cloud of file types in your repository. Succinct. And then finally, we're going to need a base URL, which actually describes where our add-on is hosted on the public internet. And base URLs for Connect add-ons have to be HTTPS, so that you've got some transport layer security there. Now, the trick here is that this has to be a URL that Bitbucket can resolve. So it can't just be a web server running on my local machine. So to do this, what I'm going to do is use a simple Python web server to start serving that file that we've just created locally. In fact, let me just open Chrome to make sure that's working nicely. Great, okay, so you can see our file is accessible locally, but that's not quite good enough because Bitbucket needs to resolve that, and obviously Bitbucket can't see a local port on my computer. So I'm going to use a little tool called ngrok to proxy that port out to the public internet. Now ngrok's a really neat little free tool that is useful for actually a whole range of web development applications, like if I wanted to share a web app that I was working on locally with a colleague of mine. But it's also really useful for Bitbucket add-ons because these URLs are addressable by Bitbucket. So this little subdomain that it's just spun up for me with SSL should be forwarding directly to my local machine. And there you go, cool, we've got a tunnel that's being proxied out to the public internet. So let's take that base URL and enter that into our descriptor here. Oops, of course, still needed double quotes. Awesome. Now, for our add-on to actually be able to make requests to Bitbucket to retrieve data, we're also going to need to define an OAuth relationship. So to do this, we need to create a modules property and an OAuth consumer property underneath that. So what this is going to do is bind an OAuth consumer relationship from Bitbucket to our add-on. So to do this, we need to actually create a new OAuth consumer relationship. So if we go to Bitbucket, and then under Manage My Account, we'll see we have an OAuth section, and that actually allows us to create a new OAuth consumer. So what we're going to call it is the file cloud. And to bind this OAuth consumer to our add-on, we actually have to make the base URL the callback URL. Now Bitbucket's never actually going to use this as a callback in the way that we're using the OAuth consumer, but this is the way to actually map the OAuth relationship to our add-on. And we need to give it the repository read permission because we're going to eventually be retrieving the contents of the repository in order to rip through it and pull out the different file types that we find. So we can save that consumer and then grab the key. And then if I browse back here, we can just put that in and that will bind that OAuth consumer relationship to our add-on. Now there's a couple more little things we need to throw in here before our add-on is actually installable. The first is a scope. So just like the scopes for our OAuth consumer, we also need to define the different permissions that this particular add-on will have. And then we also need to define the contexts that this add-on is installable in. Now there's two different contexts. There's personal, which is basically this add-on will be available for every repository that a particular user browsers to once they've installed the add-on. And then there's also the account context as well. And basically that means that the add-on will be installed for all of the repositories under the user who installed the add-on's account. And it will be exposed to anyone who browses to those repositories. Now, for this particular use case, I think personal makes the most sense, so I can instantly see the composition of a repository just by browsing to it. I'm going to save that out, and now we should have an add-on that's actually theoretically installable. So if we refresh our JSON descriptor, see that our changes are still being tunneled correctly. So let's go into the add-on section in Bitbucket and actually install it. So I'm going to use this install add-on from URL link, pop that path in there. That's going to make Bitbucket call out to that add-on and then retrieve the code to that descriptor, retrieve the contents, and then install it inside Bitbucket. Now, because we defined some scopes, it's going to prompt us to say, hey, this particular add-on will be able to read your repositories as soon as it's installed, which is exactly what we want. Cool, so our add-on is now installed in Bitbucket. And you can see our name and description are showing up in the UI. Now, this add-on, of course, doesn't actually do anything yet. We've defined some metadata, but it's not actually adding anything to the UI yet. So if I browse to, say, the AUI or Atlassian user interface repository, we're not seeing that little file types link in the left-hand side just yet. So let's fix that. So if we go back to our little screenshot of what we're building, you can see we want to add a new link to the left-hand side menu called File Types, and we want that to actually render in some UI showing all the file types in our repository. So to add that new link and that page, we actually want to define a thing called a repo page. And basically what a repo page is just that little link and then an iframe targeting our remote server. So first of all, we need to define just a little bit of metadata, a key, which has to be unique within this add-on, and then a name, which is basically the text that's going to be displayed in the UI. Note that this is actually inside a property, so we've got a little value subproperty. This is so that one day we can support proper internationalization inside our Bitbucket add-ons, although that hasn't been implemented just yet. And then we also need a URL, which is going to basically define the target of the iframe that gets rendered inside the Bitbucket UI. So to do this, we're actually going to have to start serving some HTML over the internet. So if we pop back to our repository, let's create a new file called cloud.html, which is actually going to be the contents of this iframe. As I mentioned before, this is just a simple static add-on. We're not using Node or Java or Ruby or anything to write a fully fledged web app. Instead, we're just going to be serving some static HTML using our simple Python web server. So if we open this up in Sublime Text, let's just write a really simple placeholder for the moment. Just to prove everything is working. So the only thing that we need to add into this particular into this particular file is a special script file that's served from Bitbucket. And what this does is it actually sets up a thing called a cross-domain bridge that allows the iframe to communicate with the host application, in this case Bitbucket, and vice versa. So this means that the iframe can resize itself properly based on the contents that we're providing. and also allows us to do some pretty funky stuff like making REST requests to the Bitbucket REST API from our add-ons domain. Let's just put a little hello world thing in here to make sure that it's actually rendering properly. So if we save that out, hopefully now if we browse to cloud.html, we should have a very simple HTML page opening up. So now we can enter cloud.html as our URL for this particular repository page. The next thing we want to pop in is a location. So the location describes where in the Bitbucket UI we want our link to show up. And in this case, we want it to show up in the navigation section in the left-hand side. So let's enter navigation. Navigation, that's not a word. And then finally, for just a little bit of visual flair, let's define a custom icon for our add-on as well. And if we pop back to our little spec, you can see we want a little pages icon there just to show that there's different types of files. So what I can do is use a CSS class from Aui called pages that will select that icon for us as part of the Aui default icon set. So we should be able to go to our Bitbucket Type Cloud add-on and hit update. And what that does is it calls out to our descriptor and pulls in the latest copy of it. So now we should hopefully have a new little link in the left-hand side when we refresh the page. And there you go, file types. So we've successfully modified the Bitbucket UI. If we click on it, hey, a little hello world message is showing up. So that's pretty neat. We have an add-on that's actually registered a new view inside Bitbucket and it's displaying some information. It's not particularly useful information, but it's kind of fun that we've actually managed to build something that modifies the Bitbucket UI already. So what we want to do now is actually make the add-on aware of which repository it's been installed into. And the way that we do that is by injecting a thing called a context parameter into the iframe's URL. So in this case, we're going to inject the ID of the current repository. And we do this by putting in a little curly braced token here, repo UUID, known as a context parameter. And when Bitbucket renders the iframe, it'll substitute that with the ID of the context repository. And then we can go off and use that UID to call the Bitbucket REST API and actually retrieve some contents. But for now, just to make sure it's working, let's just pull that out of the URL. So if we go repo UUID equals, and then I'm going to use a horrific regular expression to pull that out. Get my paste buffer here somewhere. Hey, here we go. Trust me, this works for this this particular use case. Obviously, there's probably a jQuery plugin or something I could use to do that instead, but this will work for now. And because this is in a URI, let's decode it. And then let's actually, oh, sorry for the typos, let's actually append it into the DOM. So if we grab that paragraph element we've defined, and then go p.textContent, I think it is, equals repo UUID. Now hopefully, with that little hello world will be substituted by the actual repo UUID of our repository. Oop, and of course we need to close that little script tag, otherwise nothing is going to work. And we save that out. So we pop back here, this time because we changed our descriptor, we're going to have to come back and add the update, press the update button again. That's just because we changed that URL, so it has the context parameter in it. And if we come back here and hit refresh, hopefully, oops, okay, I've done something wrong clearly. Cannot read property 1 of null. So it looks like we've got a problem potentially with our regular expression, location.search.match. Okay, so let me see, we're pulling out the query parameter, repo UUID, and okay, So let's just go back and check that our descriptor is correct. Oh, our query parameter isn't showing up. Did I forget to save that file? Ah, look, I did. Okay. So if we go back and update our descriptor again, and pop back over here and hit refresh. Excellent. So you can see instead of hello world, we have an actual UUID of our repository, which is just basically it's a UUID, a long, unique, uniquely randomly generated identifier for our repository. Great. Okay. So now our add-on is actually customizing itself based on the repository that it's being injected into. So the next thing we want to do is actually take that UUID and query the Bitbucket REST API. And to do that, we're going to pull in a component called request. So request is basically a little part of the JavaScript cross-domain bridge that is set up by this all.js file that actually allows us to make REST requests across domains, which is typically something disallowed by browser security policies. But in this case, it uses our OAuth relationship to make sure that it's secure. So what we can, this request API is a little bit like the jQuery Ajax method. All we do is pass it in a URL. And what we're going to do is query the Bitbucket REST API. You can enter a relative URL here. It'll actually prepend the Bitbucket part for you. And we're going to pass in the UUID of our current repository. I know the syntax looks a little bit strange. The reason we put this little double curly brace in here is because usually that's where the Bitbucket username would go. But because we're specifying a unique repository ID rather than a repository name, we can actually omit the username and just put those curly braces in instead. So this is actually going to be the URL for the content endpoint in Bitbucket. It's going to give us a set of paths sitting at the root of the repository at the head revision. So if we define a success function for when our response successfully returns, let's just loop through the files that it returns. So it returns a JSON blob, and within that there is a collection of files, and we'll just pull out the file name from each of these paths, because it's actually the full path. So file.path.substring, file.path.last index of slash +1. So this is just going to basically grab the last segment of that path, so the actual file name. And then we can use a similar trick to actually grab out the extension from the file name. Substring file name dot last index of dot +1. And this actually works quite nicely because it's going to grab just the file extension, and of course if the file name doesn't actually contain a dot, then it's just going to return the full file name, which I think is fine for us. And then let's create a new span to pop each of these in. So if we go document.create element span, and then set the text content of the span to the extension, and then let's just append that to the DOM, to the paragraph that we're pulling out up here. So instead of saying, let's get rid of that hello world, and yeah, stop logging out that repo UUID. Now hopefully, if everything works, we should just be able to refresh this page because we haven't changed the descriptor. And because Bitbucket is rendering an iframe link every time to our remote service, we can just update that with whatever we want. So if we hit refresh, now because we've set up that OAuth consumer, it's actually prompting us again to say whether it's okay for this add-on to have read access to our repository. What's kind of neat is that Bitbucket does this automatically. We didn't have to write any logic for that prompt. And you can see that it started actually rendering out the contents of the root directory of our repository. It's a little bit hard to read there, so let's actually put in a little bit of styling information. So if we just add a little bit of padding on our span, say, and make them blocks. So go back and refresh that page again. This time it doesn't prompt us for permissions because we've already granted it permissions. And you can see, hey, excellent, it's actually retrieved from some content from Bitbucket, and it's rendering it in the UI. Nice. So now if we browse to a different repository, say the Atlassian REST repository, and hit the same link, you should get some different contents. There you go. You can see this repository at the root level contains a gitignore file, text files, markdown files, properties, and XML, which is vastly different to what we find in the Atlassian user interface repository. So we've got an add-on that's displaying some actual useful data. Of course, it's still a far cry from our little spec image. We're missing colors, we're missing, and it's not actually retrieving the full contents of the repository, it's just looking at that root directory. So let's look at how we can do that. So instead of just retrieving the root contents, let's actually create a function that we can call recursively to walk down through our repositories. Let's call it a walk source tree, and the path is going to change at each level, obviously. So let's change that there. Now, if we look at the response for one of these for this request, it also has a data.directories property rather. So for our files, we can just continue to render them out for the time being. But for our directories, we actually want to recurse. Let's call that dir instead of file. And so we can call path, which is the current path, plus the directory that we're pulling out here, and then just a plus a slash as well, just because that dir doesn't have a trailing slash. Now, hopefully, if we go back to our page and refresh, you can, well, let's see. Oh, could be a problem. We're not actually calling our function at the moment. So let's start off by looking at the root directory slash. So go back and refresh the page. Okay. Excellent. You can see as each request returns, it keeps appending more and more information to our DOM, which represents all of the different file types in our repo. Excellent. So of course, this visualization isn't particularly useful because it's quite hard to get a sense of, well, how many files of each type there are, because it's just sort of spamming our DOM. So if we pop back again, instead of just appending this to the DOM, let's see if we can actually change the font size on an existing DOM element instead. So instead of creating a new one, let's go p.querySelector again, and then see if we can find an existing extension with this ID. So for this to work, obviously, we're going to need to start setting the ID on these existing spans. So if we go span and then go span.id equals extension. In fact, and we want to set the text content to the extension as well. So if we go span.id equals span.textContent equals extension. So this is if the span doesn't exist. And so let's say set the font size of these initial spans to something a little bit more readable. So say 20 pixels for that one. And then of course we need to append it to the DOM. So this is the case where the span, where a span matching that file extension doesn't yet exist. But if it does already exist, then let's just bump up the font size. Font size equals, and I guess we need to grab the existing font size. So span.style.font size, and then let's just increase it by, say, 1 pixel. Okay, sorry, a bit of a nut when it comes to aligning stuff. All right, so if we go back and refresh our page, whoop, you can see it's walked fairly deep into our repository by this stage. And hit refresh. Taking a little while for that first request to come back. There we go. Awesome. So instead of continually rendering new JS file extensions, it's just going to jack up the font size on that particular one. And immediately we can start to see the contents of the individual contents of this repository. And it's starting to look a little bit more like this page that we have here. So really the only thing left to do is add a couple of those little visual styling elements. And let's do that just for fun. So I guess the first thing we want to do is just apply some random color to each span. So let's just create a little function called random hex. Random times 256 toString. Nice. Well, actually, that might return a non-integral value, so let's floor that as well. Cool. And then actually need to apply that color. So we'll generate some random hex values. We can just append these together since it's being converted to a string already. So if we go back and refresh, and I really like this this workflow of just being able to refresh the page. Like there's no, because it's a static add-on, there's no compile step or anything like that. We're literally just modifying the HTML associated with that. Interesting. Okay, so we've got some colors, but they're kind of boring looking colors, aren't they? Have I done something a bit silly? Oh, of course, toString is just converting that to a decimal string, which is probably not what we want. So let's change that to a hexadecimal string instead. Hey, there we go. That's looking a little bit more bright and cheerful. And I guess the last thing that we need to do is apply that little rakish tilt that we have to each of these. So let's just use the little CSS transform for that. Span.style.transform. So that's our CSS transform, and I guess we can use a rotate transform for this. So let's say maybe tilt it 15 degrees either way. And times 30. It's going to be tilting based on degrees. So if we go back and refresh. Excellent. So now we've built an add-on that's actually walking through the contents of our repository, pulling out file extensions and displaying them, which is a pretty simple example, but it's pretty powerful when you think about it. There's all sorts of cool little add-ons you could build based on the contents of the repository. And that REST API that we're using, this slash source slash head, so that slash source is actually the root of all of the content APIs in the Bitbucket 1.0 REST API. The Bitbucket 2.0 REST API actually has a whole bunch of other powerful stuff as well. But instead of using head there, we could potentially specify a different commit or a different branch or tag to grab those contents instead. And there's also other Bitbucket REST APIs that allow you to list the history of a repo as well. So using this technique, you could actually crawl back through the contents of the repository, grabbing out historical data as well, and using that for all sorts of cool visualizations. And just to prove that this is kind of working dynamically, let's refresh the add-on on the Atlassian REST API as well. And you can see that that's going through, pulling out Java XML, because this is a Java project. Oops. Okay, so the layout doesn't work for very long file extensions. But yeah, you can still see that it works. The add-on itself is actually working properly. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this introduction to Atlassian Connect in Bitbucket compelling, and I'm really excited to see the kinds of add-ons that you come up with in the community.